What I want to do now is to introduce Julia Unwin, who will be chairing the session, and she will introduce our speakers today. But if you'd welcome Julia Unwin and our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome on such an incredibly cold day. I'm Julia Unwin. I'm the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rantry Foundation. We have for decades been an organisation that has tried to use evidence from research and evidence from experience to inspire lasting social change. That's what we say we're there to do, and that's what we've done for very many years. And one of the issues we have grappled with over all that time is the complicated relationship between poverty, the experience of poverty as individuals experience it in their families and in their communities, and the poverty that seems to be locked into some places, and the ways in which places respond to poverty. Now, over decades, we have regenerated areas, indeed where we are sitting now is a scene of regeneration, frequently by moving out the poor people. And one of the things we are grappling with at the moment is the notion of growth, how we return to growth in a way that doesn't just move out the poor people. I think this panel session is ideally timed to try and look at some of those big issues of how the economy impacts on the lives of people and places in poverty. My own organisation on Monday will be publishing our annual report on the state of the nation in terms of poverty, our annual monitoring report, where we only use government publicly available data to analyse what's happening. I'm not allowed to tell you what it says, but I can tell you it's not a pretty picture. For the very first time, the numbers of poor people who are working outstrips the number of people who are not working and are poor. That says something very profound to me about our economy and the place we're in. We have also this week put on our website a series of films which we commissioned with The Guardian, which tell in the voices of people who are themselves poor their very complicated, very challenging but very real experience. For me, that provides the backdrop to this session, where we are asking some extremely talented, interesting people who come from very different perspectives to reflect on these issues. Now, I've been told to say to them, and I have said to them, they get 10 minutes each. This is not a moment for long lectures and PowerPoints. This is a moment to get their perspectives so that you can then engage in a discussion with them. On the panel with me, and let me make sure I get the order right, there are two people called Paul, just to confuse me. We have Jeff Andrews, Senior Lecturer at the Open University, Paul Gregg, Professor of Economics and Social Policy at Bath, Lindsay Hamley, who's author and writer of The State's Intimate History, a fantastic, interesting book for anyone interested in housing, and Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. I don't think we could have a better group of people to help us try and think through this issue of what is the interrelationship between poverty as it's experienced by individuals and poverty as it's experienced in places. I'm going to ask them to speak in the order in which I've introduced them. I'll ask them to speak just for 10 minutes each, and then at the end we'll open it up for conversation. We'll have plenty of time for you to quiz them about individual things, but also make wider points. So Jeff, can we start with you?
Thanks very much. Hello everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. It's striking to me how much poverty is still talked about as a question of individual choice. In other words, people choosing to eat particular kinds of foods, not drawing their curtains, or yesterday the government minister cultivating a lifestyle of the state. Now, I don't think individual responsibility, we should underestimate how important that is. But I want to return to talking about systems and structures. And it also a sense of the past, of how we got to where we are. Not a matter, I think, of professional historians, but a history from below. The voices of communities, many of whom feel betrayed by experts and politicians. And this really was why we wanted to commission at the Open University the secret history of our streets, and people watched that a few months ago. We were excited by social history, by the exchange of residents and former residents who occupy very similar spaces but have very different memories and different ways of living. Different ways of living. Obviously, we were using the Charles Booth study a long time ago, but where he mapped poverty throughout London's streets. It wasn't a nostalgia journey. Rather, it was an opportunity to look at these unofficial histories and the wider stories they told of social change, class inequality, postal housing policy, and what we understand by community. And of course, in many places, rich and poor sharing the same close proximity, but very different lives and opportunities. In many streets, of course, there are stories of people being rehoused, removed, relocated. Why did they leave? And what did they leave behind? And as the series developed, we encountered bewilderment, really, of previous residents returning after many years to where they used to live, encountering, in the case of Portland Place in Notting Hill, unprecedented, unimaginable luxury. An exchange and dialogue between different social classes was revealing. It seems for a long time we left class off the agenda. Or at least we haven't left class off the agenda, but we've looked at it in a particular kind of way, somebody identified by very top-down experts, professionals, and forgotten that classes are also, live lives and experiences. And in a way, the series left unresolved questions of what went wrong. Although I think it opened up, hopefully, the possibility to look again at some of these questions. And certainly, since the series finished, and we're hoping there may be another series next year that goes beyond London, we try to encourage our students and the wider public to provide us with their own stories of social change. In other words, to look at their own communities and what bigger picture does it tell. I've read Lindsay's book the last few days and struck by quite a similar story, personal history, she'll tell you about in a minute. But she points at the end of the book towards Britain's, what she calls Britain's refusal to listen to anyone who warned that if we did not think carefully and sensitively, we would build new slums to replace the old. And I think that the history of housing policy in Britain is a story of, in some senses, not in a simplistic way, betrayal, but where voices of people have been left behind. 30 years ago in Britain, there was this sort of inquiry into change in the nature of working class, what went wrong. Jeremy Seabrook and other writers were investigating. It seems at the moment we may be in another of those periods, condition of Britain moments, where we need to look critically at our own cultural, economic heritage. I want to talk a bit about food, because it seems to me that if you look historically, food is one of the main markers of poverty, from the French Revolution to the hunger marches, even the Arab Spring, and now in Roundtree and the Guardian's Breadline Britain series, it's there again, quite prominent. Food banks, apparently, over the next year will feed 200,000 people. It's a quite extraordinary number. It was 26,000 4 years ago. This morning's Guardian, Ian Jack is talking about a nutritional crisis. And I want to say that the industrial food system, the cheap food economy, has done for diet and health what government policy and housing management has done for homes. I think it's a serious systemic crisis. They're both stories of post-war decline, of loss and short-term profit. And in my view, not in an overly journalistic way, but they've imposed particular ways of living, lifestyles, constraining choices. This is well understood in the US with Eric Schlosser and others who talked about the fast food nation. Fast food, he says, in every nook and cranny of American society, standardizing taste, changing the way people live, driving obesity crisis, and dividing rich and poor with their own very particular geography. How many miles or how many meters do you live to the nearest McDonald's? Well, not only that, the way in which cities from the highways and whole communities seem to be shaped in many ways, economically, geographically, and so on, by a fast food nation. Now, Britain is not yet like the US in that regard, but certainly is the worst in Europe when it comes to fast food. If you look at the high streets and the domination of supermarkets, I think the story is becoming clear. Now, to me, the debate in Britain has been fairly hopeless on this. This is not about moralising or telling people what food they should be eating from more experts, or about foodies and fine dining. It's about thinking about the connections between economy, health and the environment. And I think the alternative, we can see the beginnings. I mean, quite a paradoxical situation where on the one hand we have domination of supermarkets, we also have, and I know Bristol's quite a good example of this, quite rapid development of very interesting food outlets, community markets, and alternative street food, which actually doesn't cost very much, or food cooperatives. And I've written about slow food, and the slow food movement was born really with the idea that in Italy, but also in less countries with less imaginative food cultures, there is a rich history, heritage of food, which offers us a way out, not in a simplistic way, but it may be that in this time of austerity, and I think also in this time of austerity, there are a lot of angry people, people who start to, who will be quite impatient with politicians and experts. But it's an opportunity to examine more closely the way we live in a much broader sense, that we shouldn't think of poverty as a question of individual choice, nor should we see it as merely something that is here with us to stay, but think in more broader ways about how we live and what it means to be part of a community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Paul, Greg, can I ask you to?
Okay, so we've got a pretty diverse panel here, so we're going to get some pretty diverse perspectives.
That's the intention.
I'm going to particularly talk about the relationship between poverty and labour markets, or work and wages, and the changing nature of poverty in the UK, and which has heavily been driven by the changes in the labour market. If we roll back to the sort of late 60s, early 1970s, poverty in Britain was heavily focused on pensioners. Yeah, that this was the older people post-working working age, were massively sorted to the bottom of the distribution. Whether you take poverty as a particular line or just who is the poorest in the country, it was older people who didn't have enough savings or a post-retirement income to keep themselves out of poverty. Over the next sort of 30 years, there was a deep and profound shift in the nature of poverty in the UK. The kicking in of second-tier pensions, occupational pensions, earnings-related pension systems, which were increasingly protected from inflation, which was one of the major problems for poor people previously, meant that this group has progressively moved up the income distribution. Pensioner poverty has been in sustained and decline, and just generally in the population as a whole, older people are now much further up the income distribution than they were. They were replaced very starkly and very sharply by children and the families with children. And this process was that quite dramatically over a period of about 15 to 20 years, there was a major loss of work and incomes for families with children. The loss of work was in part to do with changing in family structure, so we had more lone parents, and lone parents often who were not working, very, very frequently not working. Only about a third of lone parents were working back in those kind of days. And so that there was one sort of source of social change towards families. We were getting married later, we were divorcing more frequently, children were far more frequently growing up in a lone parent family, and that was heavily associated with poverty. But even amongst couples, we saw that up to around 10% or so of couples with children were workless by the early 1990s. So we had a profound shift in the labour market, growing inequality in wages, but also this kind of profound growth of worklessness, and that worklessness increasingly became the focus of poverty in this country, and was heavily, as I say, focused on families with children. One of the shifts that accompanied that in a way was that pensioner poverty, pensions are relatively static, particularly low-income pensioners. So they were staying in the same communities which they had worked in through their working lives. And so you had interleaved a poor community of pensioners interleaved with a generalised working and non-poor population. There was high and rich, poor areas, but the population of the poor and the not so poor were fairly intermingled within the poorest neighbourhoods. Over that period, what we saw was a major resorting of poverty and worklessness into certain communities. So we saw growth of communities often associated with social housing where 40 to 50% of the households had no income even when they were working age. And this kind of produced a far more intense concentration of poverty within the space of geography. Okay? What I want to just sort of finish on is to say poverty is changing again. Okay? The nature of poverty in the UK is shifting. Worklessness did come down during the good times. We saw the number of working age households without a worker falling from about 1 in 5 households to about 1 in 6. Not a dramatic change, but a significant one. Interestingly, it's barely shifted through this recession. Worklessness and workless households have not returned through this kind of recession, and that seems to be partly driven by welfare system reform that took place. But what is changing is something else is happening in the labour market, which I think is going to be quite profound for the nature of poverty looking forward over the next few years. What we're seeing now is the first and most sustained fall in real wages that's occurred in a period outside government wage controls. We have never seen wages fall in real, relative to inflation to the sustained extent that we have recently. But even prior to the current declines in real wages were stagnant. So for the last sort of decade or so now, we have not seen rising real wages. This seems to be driven by two processes which have been going on to some extent in other countries for a while. Firstly, there's been a decoupling of wages from productivity. As growth in the past has generated productivity, we get more efficient, we produce more, that is distributed in the form of rising real wages. That seems to have stopped, or at least massively slowed down. What we've seen in the States for 30 years or so is this decoupling, is that rising productivity of the economy is no longer being shared in the form of rising living standards with the population as a whole. And this seems to have started in the UK too for the last decade. This decoupling of, if you like, the economic efficiency, which is sagging at the moment in the current downturn, but there's just this broader decoupling of the rising efficiency of an economy with the living standards of people. So what we are increasingly seeing is a return of working poverty. This is particularly associated with one-earner households. If you like, the two-earner household, the dual-earner model is working to keep families out of poverty. One-earner households are really struggling at the current time. And one of the other features of this, which I find quite interesting, is that the gender mix is profoundly shifting. Is that women's earning is increasingly central to keeping a family out of poverty in a way that it wasn't done in the previous days of the male breadwinner. That we increasingly need at least 1.5 earners, but women's wages are rising faster than male wages, slowly, but mothers' wages are rising profoundly faster than fathers' wages over the last 15 to 20 years. So mothers' earnings are increasingly central to addressing poverty, and particularly poverty with families with children. And that, in a sense, also needs a policy response to think about how do we support women working, childcare, all of that kind of stuff is central to the next wave, if you like, of social policy thinking to try and address poverty.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. An amazingly comprehensive history. Actually, I wish I'd recorded it. I hope somebody has, of how poverty has changed over the last few decades, taking us up to precisely where we are now. Our next speaker is Lindsay Hamley, who has written very movingly but also profoundly about the nature of poverty. Lindsay,
thank you, Julia. I'm so grateful to be asked to speak at this, because to listen to the other speakers and to, sort of start to get some kind of overview of the situation that we're in. I think Jeff's right, food is incredibly indicative of I think it's one of the strongest indicators of how life, how living in poverty sort of affects people at psychological and as well as kind of medical level, but also wages and income all kind of feed into what we're trying to talk about here today. But what I want to focus on, I guess, is my area of interest, which is housing and environment, the wider environment. One of my sort of convictions, I guess, while I was growing up, and then I went to study politics at university, and then eventually went on to write a book about the experience of growing up on a very large peripheral council estate outside Birmingham. One of my convictions was that class is built into the landscape. Social class and economic, social and economic inequality is physically built into the landscape of Britain. Council housing is very physically distinguishable from private housing, generally speaking. It tends to be geographically situated in disadvantageous areas, very far from sources of work, poor public transport links, in areas where, say for instance, fewer highly motivated teachers and public servants are willing to go and work and find out how people live in far-flung places like the kind of states where I grew up. And I think, we're talking about people and poverty in place now. I think the housing situation that we're in now, we can say housing crisis, but it's kind of nearly 6 years since my book first came out. We were talking about housing crisis 6 years ago. In 2007, the housing crisis was all about, we're not building fast enough, what's getting built isn't of particularly good quality, it's all 1 or 2 bedroom flats and we need family homes. Gordon Brown in spring 2007 announced that he was going to make sure that 3.3 million, I think, or 3 million new homes were going to be built by 2020. It was 7 years away from that, and at the moment I think it's something like 50 to 75,000 houses a year are getting built, and every time a major policy announcement is made by the coalition, it's always, we're going to build 50, we're going to build 50 new houses. I think that actually will get on the front pages at the moment, but we're going to build 50,000 new houses, we're going to build 100,000 affordable, 100,000 new affordable homes, and these are simply a drop in the ocean in terms of what's needed, because the situation that we face now is the consequences of 2 generations worth of political indecision, I would say, very piecemeal policy making in terms of keeping up with supply of house building, suitable house building, that's family homes. And I would argue really sort of an active political manipulation of the housing stock that we actually have in terms of selling off public housing stock and to some degree, partly through laissez-faire, but partly through, again, active political mismanagement, I would say, keeping or making sure that the supply of private rented and or most obviously owner-occupied housing is kept low, so that prices remain high. Now I've just moved to Liverpool in the last 6 months due to family. My husband's family is from that area, and I'm the sort of person who likes sitting on buses, looking out the window, and just sort of checking out places and seeing, attempting to imagine what life, might be like in the places that I'm sort of travelling through. And I don't know if anybody's caught up in, particularly the Guardian newspaper, which I write for in the last few months, a series of pieces about Anfield in North Liverpool and the failure of housing market renewal pathfinder schemes in North Liverpool, where swathes and swathes of terraced housing in and parts of North and South Liverpool have basically had something like a 10 to 15 year regeneration plan, which began sometime in the mid-2000s, and with the advent of the coalition was simply stopped in its tracks. And so housing, people were in the professionals term decanted from terraced housing with the option to move back into new housing when it got rebuilt, and the housing hasn't been knocked down, it hasn't been rebuilt. So there are large areas that are effectively standing empty. This is a long-term story. Obviously Liverpool, in common with quite a lot of northern cities and towns north of Birmingham, have experienced massive depopulation in the last 35, 40 years due to the concentration of wealth and better paid jobs in the southeast, effectively. And you know, a place like Liverpool is you know, is a city, you know, built for about 2 million people and now has a population of, you know, 500,000 or 600,000. And yet, the way in which the housing market renewal and the change of government and you know, sort of successive attempts at regeneration through gentrification really has worked is that you've got almost empty places, and yet there are places in which there are still some people attempting to continue their lives there. One place I visited was the site of a bakery, a family bakery. And of course, you know, if you've got no people to buy bread anymore in the area, then you can't sell bread anymore. And the family that ran the bakery simply had to shut up shop, taking no money from it and having to let the business die. And some individuals in the area, you know, remaining in the area, have taken it upon themselves to kind of deal with that fallout and to attempt to reopen the bakery. And the idea is that the bakery, if the bakery is open, then it will attract people to come back and live because they'll have somewhere to buy bread. And it all just seems like such an incredible mess, really. You know, Jen was talking about the Secret History of Our Streets series, and again and again, the people who had been moved out of, you know, formerly so-called slum areas, you know, that are now incredibly gentrified, or were now fairly unrecognisable to how they'd been at the turn of the last century. Again and again, people kept asking the question, why, how did this happen? And I think it's because, ultimately, I think politics is so short-term and lacks this kind of historic overview. When housing is talked about, you know, by whichever government or whichever minister is in, you know, is in that office at the time, it's always a matter of crisis management for the short-term crisis that appears to be at hand, and not looking back at how this ought to have been averted. So I think in terms of sort of poverty in place, the most pernicious aspect of the current sort of rhetoric about you know, particularly about council housing and social housing and the areas in which it's situated is a kind of inversion by people like Ian Duncan-Smith in particular of the relationship between poverty and housing and areas of poor quality housing, in the sense that I think after his visit to Easter House in 2002, where he had this, you know, Damascene conversion, it all became very, very clear to him that the reason why people were poor is because they got divorced. It seemed that estates are places of punishment, and I think he kind of tacitly endorsed that and continues to endorse that idea. You know, estates are places where you go to, you know, if you were too flaky to stay with your partner, or, you know, they're places where you're sent to, you know, if you can't be bothered to work, for instance, or where I'm completely ignoring the sort of the complexity of the relationship between, you know, poverty and almost unendurable stress, you know, the factors that lead into that almost unendurable stress. You know, bad housing, you know, bad if you're living in poor quality housing in a city and you get, say, one notch up the housing list, it's probably still going to be to some quite poor quality housing, you know, therefore the sort of stress isn't really taken away. You might get moved from a city area to a peripheral area where the public transport is very poor. Therefore, in order to get to work, you know, to a poorly paid job, which isn't close to the place where you've been housed, you might then consider it essential to have a car, making you even more poor. You know, the pressure of paying petrol, the pressure of being far away from friends and family, the kind of forced mobility, if you like, you know, having to be moved to places or having to move to places in order to find work, rather than doing it of your own volition and doing it as part of a kind of more autonomous kind of trajectory. All these things are going to lead into pressure on personal relationships, you know, and therefore the way this relationship between poverty and personal relationships is being painted at the moment. It's all completely in the wrong and reverse order, and I think that's quite intentional, really. I've probably got another 2 minutes. Sorry. I'll just sum up how I feel about the current situation. But poor housing and poor quality living environment. It's not simply a matter of just flats versus houses or old versus new, or double glazing versus not having double glazing. It's all about, is the place in which you live, is it sufficiently connected to other places surrounding you that have more abundant opportunities, that have sources, that have colleges, for instance, that have more bus stops, that have a decent doctor's surgery. And are there places where you simply won't feel so isolated that your isolation will in itself feed into the further immiseration of your own personal situation and that of your community?
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you. And thank you very much for bringing housing to the centre of this. We talked about food, we talked about history of it, and that notion of housing as the asset that changes so many things. And finally, Paul Johnston, Institute of Fiscal Studies.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, really, because I'm going to talk about numbers, which is
you're here to do, Paul. Talk about numbers.
A little bit different, I think, to some of what you've heard so far. And I'm sorry again, because I'm actually also going to ask for some audience participation. So we think about poverty, when we think about numbers, very much as how far the bottom bit of society is away from the middle or is away from the top. So poverty we usually think of in relative terms, how far away the poor are from the rest. So I'm going to start off by asking a question about that and see what sense people have about where that stands. I'm not going to let people on the front put their hands up just in case you follow. Well, you should know, all these numbers, Julia, are ones that you funded. So one first question I'm going to ask is about how far the person 90% of the way up the income distribution is. So they're better off than 90% of people. How much better off they are compared with the person only 10% of the way up the income distribution. In other words, they're worse off than 90% of people. So I'm going to ask you whether you think they are the person at that 90th percentile, 90% better off than everyone else. So, better off than 90% of other people. Are they 4 times better off than the person down at the bottom, the 10th percentile? The 10th percentile, you're in poverty on any definition that we have. So are they 4 times better off, 6, 8, 10, or 12 times better off? So that gap between someone really close to the top of the distribution and really close to the bottom of the distribution. Okay, so I'm going to start in the income, this is income, household income. So I'm going to start in the middle. Who thinks the person near the top is about 8 times better off than the person near the bottom? Come on, some hands. Everyone has to vote. So I reckon that's about 6 people. So who thinks the answer is 6 times better off? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's about 12. Who thinks the answer is about 10 times better off? Ooh, we've got some more hands. I reckon, what do you reckon, 25 people there? 30? 30. Who reckons the answer is about 4 times better off? Got about, what's that, 15? And who thinks the answer is 12 times better off? Oh, I think that's probably the most, isn't it? That's probably 30, 40. Okay. So that's the first multiple choice question. I've got 2 more, but I'll only ask 1 more. So this is a question about, are we all in it together? So in 2010, we saw the biggest fall in average incomes in this country since consistent series began. So the person in the middle of the distribution, after you take account of inflation, their incomes fell by about 3% in 1 year. So that was the fall in real living standards in 1 year for the person about in the middle of the distribution. So this question is, do we think that 3% was about the same at the bottom and the top, so 3% right across? Or alternatively, do you think the bottom did a bit better, so they only went down by 1%, and the top did a bit worse, they went down by 5%, or the other way around, did the bottom go down by 5% and the top by 1%? Okay, so those are the three options. So who thinks it was pretty much 3% across the board? No. Two brave people. Who thinks it was 5% at the bottom and just 1% at the top, so the bottom did a lot worse? That's lots and lots of people. And does anyone think it was the top lost 5% and the bottom only lost 1%? That's about six people or so. Okay, I'll tell you the answers at the end. But I'm sorry that I'm basically going to throw out some numbers as a way of describing where we are in terms of poverty. So 2.3 million, that's the number of children recorded as being in poverty according to the official definition, which is numbers of children with incomes in families with incomes below 60% of the median. 2.3 million number of children in poverty. 1.1 million is actually the fall in that number over the period from 1997 to 2010. So that's the biggest fall over a period like that in the number of children in recorded poverty. That still missed the last government's target, which was to halve poverty from 3.4 million, which would have taken it to 1.7. But 1.1 million is the fall between 1997 and 2010 in the number of children in poverty. 100%, roughly, is how much of that fall was down to increases in welfare benefits. Wasn't down to anything else. Wasn't down to increases in wages, wasn't down to increases in participation in work, it's down to increases in welfare benefits. That is an incredibly crucial bit of understanding what happened to poverty and inequality under the last government, because that kind of progress is not going to be sustainable but using the same methods when we don't have money to spend. 0% is the probability of meeting this government's child poverty targets. Those are child poverty targets that politicians of all flavours signed up to just before the 2010 election. The target was to reduce child poverty to 10% on this measure by 2020. They knew when they were signing up they had no chance whatever of meeting that target. That's the kind of politics that politicians of all flavours were playing with those numbers. There is no probability of doing that because incomes are not rising. There is no chance that we are going to be spending hundreds of billions of pounds more on social security over that period to achieve it. It's too short a period in which to change what Paul described exactly rightly as the changes that have happened in the labour market over the last 20 or 30 years. £200 billion. That's how much we spend on social security, roughly. I mean, these are all round numbers, as you'll notice, at the moment. £200 billion a year we spend on social security benefits for people of working age and people of pension age. Now, is £200 billion a big number, I hear you ask? Very difficult to know when you hear a number like £200 billion, whether it's a big number or not. Well, there's only one other thing we spend even more than £100 billion on, and that's the health service. So yes, £200 billion is a very, very big number indeed. £1 in 3, roughly, of everything that the government spends money on. Is that a lot? Well, it was only £1 in 5 back in the late 1970s. We have become much more of a welfare state over the last 30 years. We spend much more on social security as a proportion of the total than we did. We also spend much more on health than we did. Half of everything the government does is health and social security. So, why is the government, in the face of poverty and inequality, and all the things that we're worried about, talking about further reductions in welfare. Well, if it's going to make cuts in total, it has to make cuts in welfare. You can't cut total spending by any significant amount without affecting health and or welfare. And that's the numbers, that's the arithmetic. Now, of course, they have a choice about they could raise taxes and not cut welfare, but if they're going to cut spending, then that's why they end up where they are. Because 25%, that's another number, 25% is the scale of the cuts in things like local government and police and justice and transport over the 5-year period that we're living through. 25% of cuts in those areas in order to protect health and to some extent to avoid even deeper cuts in social security, given the constraints they've given themselves, which is about, of course, the total level of spending. Here's a wrong number, 100 years. I don't know what the right number is. 100 years since we've had a recession this deep. We certainly haven't had one in the last 100 years, a recession as long and deep as the one that we're in at the moment. Even if you look at the 1930s, the level of output loss this period long after the beginning of the recession was less than it is now. I don't know what the right number is, but think of 100 years. We are living in unbelievably extraordinary times. I still don't think we've quite got our heads around how extraordinary this recession is. Far worse, far longer, far deeper in terms of output than anything any of us have lived through. At least 60 years since we've had a budget deficit this big. £120 billion total amount of spending cuts over this period. And so 0% the chance that this isn't going to affect the living standards of people right across the income distribution. So these are the numbers that frame all the difficult things that we're thinking about. But actually, here's another naught: growth in real incomes in the last 15 years, or at least since the beginning of this century. Naught. No increase in real incomes across the distribution since 2001. Never had that before, at least not in recorded sort of income history. No increase in real incomes at the middle. And even by the next election, by 2015, no increase in real incomes over a decade and a half. We normally expect real incomes to increase 1.5% a year, something like that, year on year on year. It's an unbelievable period that we're living through. But here's a good naught. Number fewer jobs there are in the economy than there were in 2008. No fewer jobs. That's astonishing. Absolutely amazing, and it's something which actually kind of frames a lot of where we are at the moment. We've had the biggest fall in output that we've ever had. The economy is way smaller than we thought it would be before the recession. And whilst unemployment has risen by nothing like you would have expected given what's happened to output, and the total number of jobs in the economy hasn't fallen. So that, before I conclude, so that hopefully maybe gives you some answers to some of the questions that cut to the two questions I asked at the beginning. Actually, my second question about are we all in it together, I think you all got it wrong. Actually, incomes have fallen more at the top than they have at the bottom. And the reason for that is because social security benefits went up in line with prices and earnings didn't. And so actually 2010 was the year in which inequality fell by more than any year in the last 50 years in terms of recorded history. Now that's something that surprises people, but that is what happened in 2010. In terms of the relationship between the top and the bottom of the distribution, the 90th centile and the 10th centile, actually about 15 of you got it right, but the large majority of you were at the wrong end. And I'll tell you why you were at the wrong end. So most of you thought it was 10 or 12 times as big. The answer is actually 4 times as big. Now why is that? That's a very surprising number. And that's because the difference between the 99th percentile and the 90th percentile is so huge. When you think of the rich, you're probably thinking of chief executives and people in the city and people on £150,000 a year. To be at the 90th centile, if you're a single person, you only need to be earning £30,000 or £40,000 a year. That's the difference. Whenever you see stuff in the press about the rich, they nearly always mean the top 1% or the top 0.5% or the top 0.1%. There's a bigger gap in incomes between the 99th centile and the 90th than there is between the 90th and the 10th. Now, that gap between the 90th and the 10th has grown over time from about 3 times to 4 times over the last 30 years. But that's the scale of the gap we're looking at. So just to actually end, really, where Paul ended, I thought he did a brilliant kind of history of where we are. We've had a huge increase in inequality over the last 40 years. Over the 1980s, that was a big increase right across the distribution. Over the last decade, it's really just been the top 1 or 2% who have pulled miles away from everyone else. The rest of us actually have been pretty much in it together. Pensioners are, as Paul said, no longer the group who are overwhelmingly in poverty. It's very much more working age people. Wages are static and have been static for an astonishing period of time. And to move to the last point, housing is much too expensive. If there are 2 things that we need to think about in terms of dealing with poverty, I think the first one is build not 50,000 homes a year, but 300,000 homes a year. And the second is to worry about the education system and the social immobility that creates. I'll give you one last number around that. 55. You're 55 times more likely to go to Oxbridge if you're at a public school than if you're on free school meals in a state school.
Deeply shocking figure, thank you. So there you have it, 4 experts from very different perspectives, all focusing on this issue of why are we in this state. I just wanted to add to Paul's number. He said, I'm not using numbers because I always get them wrong. He said when you read in the press about the rich, they mean the very super rich. Equally, when you read in the press about the middle, they mean people at the 90th percentile.
Yes,
so when
that's
they say
absolutely
the middle,
right.
they actually mean the pretty rich, because people at 30 and 40,000 are the 90th percentile. All the papers currently are talking about awful it is for the middle. Today we're focusing on not the squeeze middle, the poorer than that.